Welcome to Sometimes Love Isn't Enough, the Parenting Through Challenges podcast. I am your host, Angie Grant, and here in this podcast, it my focus is on helping parents, caregivers, whatever your role is in kiddos' lives, to really not only see our kids differently, because quite frankly, we have evidence all around us that our kids need us to show up differently. I feel like we're in this space as parents where we're like desperately trying to stop all of the chaos that's happening, right? And it might not be your child that's causing the chaos, but we see this huge surfacing of more and more problematic behaviors, whether you look at how many kids are, diagnosed with ADHD or some other type of neurodiversity, or how many scary things are happening in our kids' schools, or how teachers are struggling to manage behaviors in their classroom. Our kids are showing us that they need different than we did. And it can feel easy to say, when I was their age, this is how we manage behaviors, but that likely isn't going to work for our kids and moving forward because energetically our kids need something different. And so this podcast is all about helping us see our kids differently because they are different. Energetically, our kids are different than we were and different than our parents were and their parents and their parents. And then the other purpose of this podcast is to give you practical tools so that you know what the heck to do with that, right? Because my guess is if you're listening here today, that something in your gut led you here, told you that our kids need us to see things differently. So the other day, I was chatting with a mental health therapist, and she had recently provided a workshop for a group, a faith group. And she was describing to me how the most pressing or present thing for the participants in this group was this fear of failure. This fear of failure as a human, as a parent, as a member of society. And we started having this discussion about how when my son was younger and behaviors were so challenging, I didn't really put these words to it then, but I certainly do now, that my behavior with my son was wholeheartedly driven by fear. I thought in the moments, in all the moments, that my decisions for my son were were driven by a deep and unconditional love for him. And I wanted him to be happy and feel safe and feel connected. And for sure, that was part of it. But also, I had this deep fear that the behaviors that we were seeing in our home, the behaviors we were getting calls about from the school and from, the local authorities, my nervous system believed that these behaviors were evidence that perhaps he wasn't capable of being a productive member of society. And that triggered such a deep-seated fear in me that I didn't even have words for at the time. And perhaps, you know, back then, 10 years ago, when things were so challenging, I probably did say, I just want him to be a productive member of society. This was what I strove for as a parent. And part of me wanted him to be happy and, like I said, feel safe, right? That of course was part of it. But that fear that drove me, right? It wasn't the fear that he wouldn't feel lovable or that fear that he wouldn't feel connected. It was the fear based on the behaviors that I saw. My whole nervous system on a daily basis was reacting to that fear. And when our nervous system is reacting to something and operating out of fear, it drives us to say and do things that don't match what we really want in our heart. And so that's what I want to dig into a little bit deeper today is What does that fear look like? How does it show up in our families? And then what do we get to do about it? When I think about this fear of failure, failure as a parent, failure as, a community member, failure as a human, right? As a mom, as a parent, we we have this drive, this innate drive to continue our species, right? It's part of being a animal, right? And yet, as humans, then we also have these existential fears. But I think that this failure one, this failure of like fear of failure, I think is so much deeper than something that we learn from our parents. And that's part of it, I think. But I also think that it's part of being a mammal, right? We as mammals need our kids to be productive, be safe, be helpful in order for them to carry on our species. And that we don't think about our kids right like that, right? But it's a part of how we operate. It's a part of how we show up for our kids. So then when we get evidence that our kids are misbehaving or they're sassing us back, it triggers in us this fear of like, oh my gosh, nobody's ever going to hire them. If my child keeps acting the way that they do, nobody will ever hire them. They won't be able to hold a job because they don't have the social skills or the emotional intelligence to hold a job. That fear for us and parents will cause us, instead of showing up with compassion and perhaps nurturing and supporting our kids, when our nervous system has been so triggered time and time and time again, what happens is that even for those of us who are, here on this planet to teach others and to help kids and to help, for those of us, or at least I'm speaking from my own experience, for me, that repeated evidence in my outside world of behaviors kept nicking away at the way my nervous system was responding. And my nervous system kept feeling like it was getting more and more evidence. It was becoming more and more emotionally reactive to this fear that he wouldn't be able to hold a job. He wouldn't be able to keep a relationship. He wouldn't be able to do the things that adults do to become productive members of society. And so then there was this disconnect in me, right? My heart wanted him to know how loved he is. My heart wanted him to know how valued he is, and that whatever had happened in his past was not happening anymore, and that he's safe and loved. And yet this fear driving the way that my nervous system was reacting was was leading me to create more control, more restriction, more rules around the way that he was behaving, which led to friction in our relationship, which did the opposite of what my hope and my goal for him was. When I was so driven by this fear, instead of helping him see and believe that he was lovable and deserves love and, deserves to be connected and supported and safe, because I had this fear that was driving the way that I was showing up for him and all the things I was putting into place and all the supports, I was so driven to make sure he had all of these supports, but they were driven by fear, not by love and support. And so, inevitably, in my fear-driven parenting response, I did the opposite of what I wanted to do for him, which was to show him how safe and loved he is. And so this fear of failure, this, drive to want to create productive members of society, it seems easy to say, yeah, let's just change our thought process about that. And that for sure works for some people. But for me, at least, when my nervous system was so reactive, right? I'd get a call from the school about behavior or an incident or the authorities getting called. And my nervous system was instantly going into fight or flight mode. My adrenaline would kick in. I would have this experience, right? I'm at work and I get this call and my adrenaline would kick in. And then later I would have this adrenaline crash. My system was going through it again and again and again. And that response in my nervous system was driven by fear. Fear for things that may not have actually been happening, right? Because I wasn't in imminent danger in the moment when I got a call from the school, and my son wasn't either. But because I had this fear that my nervous system was holding on to, then when I would get those calls or I'd have my own interactions, my nervous system was so triggered that I wasn't showing up for him the way that I wanted to because adrenaline was running the show, quite frankly, which impacted me. It impacted my health. It impacted my mental well-being. It impacted our relationship and it impacted him. I know that when I'm stressed, he's stressed. When I am um, struggling with my own emotional wave, that he picks up on that. And those things I know have the power to impact our kids' sense of self-worth. When they feel like their behaviors are creating chaos in a relationship, when they feel like their behaviors are creating stress in the people that they love, that they care about, it gives them this message that they're the problem or that they're not worthy enough of unconditional love. It's not that I don't love him unconditionally, it's that my nervous system was overpowering my desire to show up with unconditional love. Because that's how we're wired, right? Our nervous system is wired to jump in when it perceives a threat or danger. And that's exactly what was happening. It wasn't choosing fear over love. My nervous system was doing that for me. It is a safety or a survival strategy that's deeply wired in us. But the problem is that our nervous system doesn't know the difference between existential fear and actual real danger, like a tiger chasing you. Our nervous system just perceives danger and responds accordingly. And so, what do we do about this? Well, I think the first thing is really deeply understanding our kids and what drives their behaviors. And there's so much that we can dig into about what's in our kids' human design that can, and what's in ours, that can help us better understand perhaps what is leading to their behaviors. If, for example, you have a kiddo who, I mean, both of my kids are projector types, which doesn't by any means innately make somebody have behaviors, but it can create this space where when insight and ideas are uninvited by me, for example, so when my son was saying things that he knew to be the truth because of his energetic design, but as a parent, I didn't know this about him, and it felt rude and insulting. And so that friction that it created between us because I didn't know, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because I didn't know to invite his ideas and his insights. Or when kiddo, for example, has a kiddo who is a manifester type, where they feel this drive to do and explore, or a third line profile to do and explore, how to parents that can make us feel like our kids are misbehaving or being defiant or not following the rules. And yet they're just being who they are. But those things can create friction in our relationships. Or, as another example, if one of our kids has the opposite end of the channel of our most important energies in our chart, that when one of us is off kilter can create friction in us. We can feel overpowered or this energetic need to stand up for ourselves, as an example. So, understanding our energetic needs and also our kids can be a powerful way to start to reframe the way that we look at our kids, the way that we break that pattern of that fear of failure. Because I look back and I think some of the things that I really, I wish I knew then, and I'm not beating myself up by saying this, I just didn't know them. It wasn't time for me to learn these things. But had I known about my son's design then, it would have given me different insights about what kind of beautiful energy he would bring into the world as a young adult. But when he was younger and I didn't understand his design, it felt like friction to me. It felt like defiance. It felt like disobedience. It felt hard. And so my nervous system responded accordingly. I felt like I was losing control in my own home. And I think a very important next step in this process is understanding our own nervous system and doing something about it. Because, quite frankly, I felt like it was inevitable that I was going to be reactive because my son's behaviors were the problem, or at least that's what I had convinced myself. And that's what I would say many of the professionals around me had convinced me of. And they were well-meaning, but in their words of saying, of course you're stressed. His behaviors are so hard. Of course that this is overwhelming. He's a lot. Of course you can't connect with him because sometimes love isn't enough. These are the words that I heard from professionals who cared deeply about me, my son, our family, but they didn't know or share with me powerful tools to help regulate my nervous system so I could be present for him instead of being reactive to him. I thought that was inevitable, and it isn't. And then the third piece, too, that I often share with parents, which, could come right after human design, but really understanding mistaken motivations and how, as humans, we all use mistaken motivations. It's our way of poorly communicating to those that we love that we have an unmet energetic need. And so when our kids are trying to exert more control, or when our partner is trying to exert more control, or when we are trying to exert more control, it's really a signal that we're feeling disempowered. And when we know that, we get to do something about it instead of feeling like we need to then take back control, which never works, quite frankly, right? We have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old in our house, and they go through these waves, right? Like one day one wants to be more in control, and the next day the other one. And then some days they both want to be in control. And it never really works for them or for us if any of the adults try to take back control. But when we're able to foster their need for control in an age appropriate way, then we're actually still in control as the adults, and they feel empowered. The kids feel empowered when we understand that it's a mistaken motivation. It's not a behavior problem. It's not defiance. It's just an unmet need. They don't yet know how to communicate. And quite frankly, I say they don't yet know how to communicate, but most of us don't. Most of us misbehave as adults similar to the way we did when we were kids. Just our words are different now, or maybe we're, a little bit more crafty about being passive aggressive. Some people not. Some people are more aggressive. But nonetheless, those behaviors are driven by mistaken motivations. And when I learned about this way of looking at behaviors, right? Like I'm a speech therapist. I had learned quite some time ago that all behaviors are a form of communication, which is kind of easy to apply to kids, kind of. But then what I find for myself and for others is that we all have our breaking point. Like, the kicking, the yelling, the screaming. Okay, yeah, those behaviors are communicating. But then when a child steals from us, we're like, oh, they're a bad kid, right? We all have our limit of, and it's different for everybody. Instead of saying like, oh, what is that behavior trying to communicate? But we tend to, when we're well educated, we tend to tolerate some behaviors and try to figure out what they're communicating. And then we hit our limit. And with my son, he was especially great at figuring out where all of my limits were and pushing all of the buttons. And had I been able to take a step back and really look at them through the lens of mistaken motivations and regulate myself while doing it, it would have just had such a different impact on my nervous system and the way that I could show up for him. So, as we're wrapping up today and thinking about, my goal for this episode was about identifying that fear of failure and how really prevalent it can be for so many parents and how problematic it can be, right? It isn't just a problem for us, this fear of failure. I mean, it can lead to perfectionism and things like that as well. But then it also has this huge impact on your relationship with your kiddos, this huge impact on your child's nervous system and their sense of self-worth. And so if I were to give you one thing to do today, it would be to consider tapping. Consider using or some other strategy. I love tapping. I just find it just wildly effective. It's silly, it's simple, and I love it. It's just so pointed, at least for me and those that I've shared it with. So consider that. Consider doing something that works for you to regulate your nervous system. I'd love to share this tool with you. I offer sessions for EFT tapping, but it, but there are lots of other people that do that as well. Really, though, what I am really trying to say is that do something to take care of your nervous system because your kids need you to be regulated so that you can be present for them, so that you can look at their behaviors differently instead of being stuck in the loop of reactivity. This is what our kids need from us. This is what I am imploring you to do is to take action to regulate your nervous system so that we can start breaking these generational patterns of trauma and help shift the trajectory for our kids because it just is tricky right now for our kids and on so many levels. So let's do something positive about it. That is all for this episode today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me here. And until next time, keep regulating.